All right, well, thank you again, Glenn, and for your crew here. I'm Stephen Kinnaman, and it's my pleasure to be with you to present my latest talk on naval history. Before I get started, and appropriate to what we just heard from Johnny, let me read to you a brief quote from Edmund Burke, a British statesman. "History is a pact between the dead, the living, and the yet unborn." Think about that statement and what we're putting up with today in this age of presentism, which is the tendency to judge everything that's happened in the past by present political focus. I mean, to tell this audience it's wrong is like telling the Mississippi to go uphill. This is a organization that's dedicated to preserving history, and we all need to hear all of the history, good, the bad, and the ugly, and then we can make our judgments. All right, so let's get started on the talk. Today I will tell you the story of a young fighting Texan, Edward J. McDermott, who gave us all to the Confederacy. My story's starting point is a conversation I had with Finney Clay about the need to tell our audiences more about Southern naval history, and perhaps with an emphasis on Texas. Next. How did I discover McDermott? I thought back in the famous Confederate States naval officers I was familiar with: Raphael Semmes of Alabama, Franklin Buchanan of Maryland, James Dunwoody Bullock of Georgia, Casby Ap Roger Jones of Virginia, but no Texans. So I pulled out my trusty volume of the officers of the Confederate States Navy, and I began to search. Let's examine McDermott's record. From other sources, I was able to cull his birth and death dates. The official records note in what state an officer was born in and from what state they were appointed to the service. At least most of them do. In the case of the Confederate records, there were a lot of blanks for reasons you can only imagine. After my examination, I had identified 13 Texas naval officers, but none of them had a service record as active as McDermott's. Before I go further, let me say that often you will find this name spelled McDermott with an O, but I chose to stick with the spelling of his official Confederate States Navy record and also the spelling on his headstone, as you'll see. As a biographer, I found you can't go wrong by doing the latter. Next. So what do we know about McDermott? Here are the basics of his family story, and I apologize for not being able to find a picture of McDermott. Edward was born in Arkansas in 1843, and the McDermotts moved to Dallas County when he was 7. His family had grown to 3 brothers and 3 sisters before his father died. His mother then ran a boarding house. In those days, the Big D was little more than a collection of stores, yards, and a newspaper office. McDermott was appointed a midshipman to the U.S. Naval Academy in 1858. In that year, the Naval Academy was just 13 years old, having been founded in 1845 on the grounds of old Fort Severn at Annapolis, Maryland. All appointments to the Academy then and now come from a member of Congress, the Vice President, or the President. Just who appointed McDermott and why he was chosen are not known. As you can see, he served in the United States Navy for 2.5 years. He didn't finish the full 4-year program at Annapolis, but he learned a lot in that short time. Next. On to Memorial Hall. This is the sacred building in the United States Naval Academy grounds where they honor the fallen. You have learned by now that McDermott resigned from the U.S. Naval Academy and went south at the opening of the Civil War and was officially killed in action. You'll hear more about the details as I go on. His name was listed in the Naval Academy's Sacred Memorial Hall, one of 14 members of his class of 1863, but it is struck through with a line, as are all the others who served in the Confederacy. This is off the official, I took it this way, off the official Naval Academy website. Now, whether what is carved on the wall is crossed through with a line, I can't tell you, but this is the way it was presented on the website, and here is the weak explanation the U.S. Navy gives for this sacrilege. These are your woke taxpayer defense dollars not at work for you. Think about this. I mean, I was shocked when I found this. I realized he was there. Then I heard about this memorial hall, and I searched further, and bingo. Okay, next. Let's take a look at McDermott's experience as a midshipman. 3 midshipmen in uniform are shown, casually dressed at center, with service dress to the left, full dress to the right. A midshipman was initially appointed as acting until a satisfactory service record allowed him to be warranted as a midshipman. Only after he graduated from the academy and passed the requisite examinations would he receive a warrant as a passed midshipman. It was an actual rank. Next. The USS Constitution was employed as the Naval Academy's training ship in the late antebellum years. Another vessel, Plymouth, captained by Commander John Dahlgren, does that name ring a bell? Dahlgren, the guns, was also used at this time for gunnery training. So you can imagine McDermott being trained on Old Ironsides and then by John Dahlgren. A summer cruise was just the thing to whip sea sense into the young middies. This illustration shows Old Ironsides early in her long and storied life, much as she was designed in 1794 by the Navy's first naval constructor, Joshua Humphreys. Humphreys is the subject of my next book, actually. All right, the focus of this slide is McDermott's going south. Note that he did not make his move when Texas seceded on the 1st of February, or when the Confederacy was formed on the 18th of February. Instead, McDermott resigned his warrant from the U.S. Navy on the day after Virginia seceded. So think about it. He's a young cadet in where? Annapolis, Maryland, and he hears the next morning that Virginia has seceded. Now, Virginia had an agony to decide to secede. South Carolina's convention took 3 days. Virginia's convention took 7 weeks. And the thing that really pushed Virginia over was when Lincoln called up the militia, 75,000, and he gave Virginia's quotas 3,500 of their soldiers to come under Yankee colors to suppress the South. That kicked them out of the Union. In 1861, as I've given you the hint, Virginia was the pivotal state whose decision for or against secession determined whether America would be at war with itself, and she decided to secede. It was 6 days after Beauregard fired on Fort Sumter, and the rest is history. Okay, next. McDermott's first service for the Confederacy was the defense of New Orleans. He traveled to Richmond, not yet the Confederacy's capital, then on to Savannah, and finally ended up in New Orleans, where he was assigned to the new-built ironclad Louisiana. While the Big Easy was the United States' 6th biggest city, it was the largest in the South, whose loss would be a crippling blow to the Confederacy. But there was another reason why he was sent. Next. It was to defeat General Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan. And let me explain the general strategy. By 1861, Scott was grossly obese and in poor health, but he was still capable of clear strategic thinking. Scott's Anaconda Plan to defeat the South was quite simply to squeeze it to death by blockading its ports and fighting for control over its central commercial avenue, the Mississippi River. My compatriot Jerry Nelson here gave us a good talk a couple months ago about Vicksburg and its central role in that campaign. Okay, next. Soon enough, the Yankees were on New Orleans' doorstep. Farragut's fleet crossed the bar at the mouth of the Mississippi, followed by Porter's fleet of mortar schooners. The Confederate defenses at Forts St. Philip and Jackson were backed up by a hastily cobbled up fleet of improvised warships. And you can see them sitting in the channel here, boom in the river, the two forts, and this is the way Farragut would have come up the river. Among them was McDermott's ship, the monster ironclad Louisiana. That's shown down here in the lower inset. This unwieldy vessel was propelled by 2 paddle wheels and 2 propellers, none of which was effective, and armed with 16 guns. It sounds impressive, but she is impossible to maneuver in the river's current. And here comes Farragut, one of the great Civil War naval action paintings. This fine view shows the Admiral's fleet as it broke through the boom, blocking the Mississippi at the forts. You see Louisiana in the foreground, that was McDermott's ship, and the ironclad Manassas here to the right, attempting to stop Farragut and his flagship, the steam sloop Hartford. Mortar shells rained down from above. It's impressive that the South could improvise its 2 ironclads in a matter of months and make such a valiant stand. The Federal fleet reached New Orleans at noon on the 25th of April, 1862, but the forts held out for 3 more days before some of their defenders, infected with defeat, refused to fight. Without the fort's cover, Louisiana was doomed. Her crew set her afire and she blew up. It was McDermott's first escape in what would be a very active career. Next. Now here's a good place to have an overview of the South's creative ironclad program. Did you realize they built so many? Okay. This chart shows them from the earliest at the top to the latest at the bottom. It was quite an accomplishment for the South to do this as a so-called agrarian society with limited industrial resources. The one thing you'll see if you look carefully is compared to the Union monitors, which had these very mechanically complicated revolving turrets, John Ericsson's signal invention, the Southern ironclads featured simpler fixed casemates, which as the war progressed became shorter and shorter to conserve scarce iron. So you can see this, the first ironclad really was Virginia ex-Merrimack. Here's Louisiana, perfect monsters. By the end of the war, look at the CSS Texas, launched at Richmond in 1865, has a very short, compact casemate with a few pivot guns. That's all you need on a river battle is a few good guns. The old idea was to build a broadside ironclad to take on frigates, but as the war went on, the battles were on the rivers, estuaries, and the short, smaller, handier, cheaper ship became useful. It was also a law of diminishing returns for the South, because to armor one of these ships, they had to tear up railroad iron. And when you tear up railroad iron, the trains stop moving. And when the trains stop moving, you can't ship other things to defend the Navy Yard that you're building the ironclad in, and you can see where that's going to head. Okay, next. Meanwhile, after dragging himself off Louisiana, apparently unharmed, McDermott was next assigned to a stint in his home waters state on the gunboat Harriet Lane. She had been captured in a blaze of rebel glory at the Battle of Galveston Bay on the 1st of January, 1863. We were having a little chat about this at lunch, in fact. During that fight, her U.S. Navy captain, Commander Jonathan Mayhew Wainwright II, was killed. 79 years later, in 1942, his grandfather of the same name, Jonathan Mayhew Wainwright, a general now in the U.S. Army, surrendered all U.S. forces in the Philippines to the Japanese. This is a family with bad karma. Next. After a quiet interlude in Texas and now a master in rank, McDermott was reassigned probably sometime in early 1864 to Mobile Bay and more adventure. Together with Galveston, the port of Mobile remained open, that's in the Gulf periphery, to blockade runners. The Confederacy's survival demanded that they remain open. It was McDermott's next challenge. And here in Mobile, he met with unexpected duty. On the 30th of June, 1864, the fast British steamer Ivanhoe ran aground off Fort Morgan, trying to run the blockade. McDermott had been promoted earlier in the month to second lieutenant. With his help, the Confederates salved her cargo and even her machinery, but then the Yankees, goddamn them, sent a boarding party and torched the vessel. But her iron hull is still in the sands off Fort Morgan. Okay. According to the official Confederate States Navy record, McDermott was next assigned to the CSS Tennessee, although another account does say he served on the smaller nearby ironclad Huntsville. Let's go with Tennessee. Tennessee was perhaps the South's most powerful ironclad, but as with her sisters, she was hobbled by weak machinery. She was armed with only 6 guns. You can see this shortening of the vessel casemates, 2 7-inch and 4 6.4-inch Brooke rifles, but they were hardly a match for the Yankees' 11-inch and 15-inch Dahlgren smashers. And note the futuristic stealth-like appearance of this menacing warship. She looks like something out of our 21st century Navy. Next. Farragut and Hartford again. Damn! Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. Here we have a magnificent view of the Battle of Mobile Bay, the 5th of August, 1864. This famous engagement opened with the spectacular loss of the Monitor Tecumseh to a torpedo, or as we will call it, a mine. And look at the size of the Union fleet behind her. Now, can you believe that the U.S. Navy let Hartford, Farragut's workhorse flagship, sink at her dock in Norfolk in the 1950s rather than restore her like Constitution? It happened. This is an iconic steam sloop, Civil War era, none in existence. They let her just sink at the dock and then they scrapped her. Okay. Next. This gives a good image, a good impression of the close-range cannonading both sides experienced during this battle. After a fierce fight against the odds, her steering gear shot away, gun port lids shattered, unable to maneuver, daylight visible through her armor, and surrounded by a Union fleet, what did the rebels do? They fought on for another half an hour. Then they surrendered. It meant the loss of a scarce southern naval asset, but also one of the Confederacy's last blockade running ports on the Gulf Coast. A sad day to the South. Next. And here is the mighty warship's surrendered second national flag, courtesy of the National Civil War Naval Museum in Columbus, Georgia. And McDermott, while captured, he escaped from a Yankee prison in New Orleans to fight again. Yeehaw! Okay. Good for you. Next. Next, McDermott served briefly on the Confederate States steamer Webb. This little steamer, an ex-New York towing vessel that had been converted into a cotton-clad ram. See, these Southerners are always inventive in this way. I love this, a cotton-clad ram. Served on the Confederate Red River defenses. But McDermott was sent back to Mobile, and so he missed what came next. Very late in the war, very late, under the command of the wild man, Lieutenant Charles Reed, Webb made a daring do-or-die attempt to run the Union blockade at New Orleans 17 days after Appomattox. Okay. He didn't make it. He had to beach and burn his ship, but boy, he sure tried hard. McDermott wasn't on board, but this is another story that needs to get told. Okay. Now we move on to McDermott's, unfortunately, his last adventure. Now based again in Mobile, he was ordered to suppress contraband activities on Lake Maurepas in Louisiana. Lake Maurepas is over here adjacent to Lake Pontchartrain. And here is Ponchatoula, and Springfield, which will come into the story, is just to the west of it. His second in command was a Lieutenant Harris, and his force consisted of 45 men. They headed overland from Mobile to Springfield, Louisiana, and note that McDermott's men were forced to travel by land because of the ever-vigilant Union blockade. So the Union Navy had just taken the forts off of Mobile. They had not taken the city yet, and wouldn't until the very end of the war. They had Ship Island, and of course they were occupying New Orleans. So if you wanted to get from here to there, you had to go overland. Okay, next. Now, reading from a later account, which gives some explanation to the kind of jerky syntax, I'll tell you what happened next. After leaving Mobile and putting their boats on rail cars and wagons, the long journey to Springfield began. Arriving in Springfield, they continued 2 miles west, coming shortly after dark to the home of Judge Marcus Carter. His home is still extant. It's part of a golf course plantation right now. They set up camp under live oaks east of the dwelling. The officers were extended an invitation to supper, and meals were provided for the remaining members of the command as well as their horses. You can't forget the horses. After supper, the men placed their boats into the Blood River. I mean, this gets almost too good with these names. Next. Now here's the geography of McDermott's operation, and a considerable degree of pre-planning was required. Guided by Louis Bernard and John Davidson, 2 local guides, they rode down the Blood River. This is where the plantation house was, now a golf course. I wonder if Donald Trump has heard about that. The Blood River, it's hard to see it. It kind of snakes down here and merges into what's called the Tickfaw. They rode down the Blood River, reaching Rome Ferry at approximately 10 p.m., and now on the Tickfaw River, they carefully proceeded into Lake Maurepas. So they're coming out here. There the men divided into 2 parties, one led by McDermott and Bernard, and the other by Harris and his guide Davidson. McDermott located the vessel he sought, anchored a half mile from the mouth of the Amite River, which is down here where the star is. It was the contraband schooner. His men boarded the vessels and found Union soldiers in the hold. The command to surrender resulted in a half-hour firefight, leaving McDermott and his guide dead. The lieutenant's men seized the captured vessel and another schooner. Now you can imagine what a half an hour of fighting would have been like on a vessel that big. It must have been brass knuckles and teeth. They seized the schooner and another vessel and traveled back via the Tickfaw River to the Blood River, where they sold the supplies to the community at Warsaw Landing. The schooner was then returned to its owner, and the gunboat burned in the bend of the Blood River. Lieutenant McDermott and Mr. Bernard were taken to the cemetery at Springfield and buried on the 13th of March, 1865. This is less than a month before Appomattox. Lieutenant McDermott's final resting place is today marked by a UDC headstone and a plaque relating the events leading up to his death. Only after I completed my research into McDermott and compiled this presentation did I learn from my SCV camp compatriot, excuse me, Jim Dennison, of the Raphael Semmes SCV camp property located near Mobile, and that bears his name, although spelled with an O. So there's a Fort McDermott. Obviously, someone else has heard about McDermott's story in Mobile, which makes a lot of sense. And here we have some images of the campgrounds and some SCV reenactors doing their thing. Thanks. Okay, that brings us to the end of the McDermott part. Any questions or comments or